Coffee drinking was a very elite thing. There were these kahve khane, which were coffee shops in the chalks and all that, in the Chandni Chowk, etc. There were these coffee shops where people used to meet. Again, the elite and the poets would recite their poetry and things like that. I remember I was working on a project which the DDA was working on a little while ago on making the new master plan for Delhi. So the new master plan for Delhi, they wanted to map heritage, and their idea was a very simple and somewhat boring one ke, jo bhi protected monuments hai, let us just map those. And there are a lot of protected monuments in Delhi, and they just wanted to map those monuments, right? And we said, why just restrict yourself to monuments? Map people. There are pockets which have very interesting cuisine because of the dominant community that lives there, right? So there are very distinctive areas where you have different pockets of cuisine. Those are the kinds of things you should be mapping.
Yeah. Today, we are stepping into a city that is not just lived in. We are stepping into a city that has been constantly remembered, erased, argued over, and constantly reinterpreted. Delhi has been built on what was here before that, and it is built on the remnants of all those older cities. The history of Delhi is not about its rulers and empires. It's a history about neighborhoods that hold memories. It's about the streets that hold stories and the policies that continue to shape our understanding of the belonging. Today we are joined by Dr. Swapna Liddle, who has written books like Shahjahanabad, Mapping a Mughal City, Chandni Chowk, The Mughal City of Old Delhi, and Connaught Place and the Making of New Delhi. She is a heritage conservationist and one of the most influential public historians in India. Public historians often say that cities cannot be understood only through monuments or dates, but rather through lived experiences. Dr. Liddle's work reflects this philosophy. She writes in Chandni Chowk that Delhi survives in fragments. She notes in interviews with The Hindu and Scroll that cities are palimpsests and that her aim is to take history to the streets. Dr. Liddle, welcome to Postcards. So where did your love for Delhi start, and how did you get fascinated with its history and eventually got into writing your first book?
Working on a PhD from JNU, I dropped out of that. I went through some, my mother-in-law was terminally ill. It was difficult. So I dropped out of that and I said, मैं अब कभी नहीं होगा ये. I will never be able to do my research. I'll never be able to teach. Forget it. So I dropped out of all of that. And then after that, I became interested in the history of Delhi. And I said, oh wow, let me just write a book. I said, let me just write a book, a history book on Delhi. And I said, 19th century is an area I'm comfortable. I'll write on the 19th century. I went to the Delhi archives.
Okay.
And I said, okay, I want to look at files and papers and I want to do some research. Madam, aap kahan se? So I said, kahin se? Right?
And they're like, good to dikhao.
So I said, see, I have an MPhil.
Yeah.
I have an MPhil. I'm a historian. I have an MPhil, a published MPhil. I've done an MPhil. I've done an MPhil. I want to write a book and I want to do research.
Yeah.
Kisi newspaper says nahi. Kisi, are you from a institution?
Yeah.
I said nahi. तो फिर आप किसी गेजेटेड ऑफिसर से चिट्ठी लिखवा लीजिए.
Of course, चिट्ठी.
गेजेटेड ऑफिसर से. तो हमारे तो फ्रेंड्स में थे तो हमने लिखवा लिया. बट ऐसे कि मैं हर जगह जाऊंगी तो मुझे यही करना पड़ेगा. Then I said, चलो ठीक है, एक PhD कर लेते हैं.
Yeah.
Then I went to Narayani Gupta ma'am. And I said, please, I would like to do a PhD. I told her very frankly that I said, I really want to write a book.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to do, but I want to do a PhD.
Yeah.
So she said, okay, ठीक है. So she was not my supervisor because she said, I'm going to retire.
Yeah.
And if I retire and you have not completed your PhD, you'll be in a mess. So I did my PhD with Mukul Keshavan and Azizuddin Hussain. But that's why I came to Jamia, because she was in Jamia. And I did my PhD there. So, like, literally, I did it because I just wanted that thappa of a university, which I could take the letter and say, मैं यहाँ से हूँ, मैं PhD कर रही हूँ.
But that's so funny,
the
right?
bureaucracy that is there in our...
And you're just following.
So that's what I'm saying, that if you're an independent researcher, there's a lot of bureaucracy that is kind of hard. Huh?
To manage,
so,
navigate.
It is. And I think it's become even worse now. Even historians who are working on things, and this digitization thing is a double-edged sword. Because what happens is a lot of institutions like archives who do digitization then think that you don't need to look at actual files. They say, नहीं आप तो online देख लीजिए, आपको आने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. So, and there are things that you miss if you are only looking online.
Yeah, right.
Even through their own repositories.
Right.
Sometimes you discover things simply by
looking at it.
Looking at other things. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, I've never done this work, but like, I would just imagine I'm like, मैं कुछ पलट रहा हूँ in the margins, there is something, or there's an extra paper.
You discover new themes by looking incidentally at other things.
Right.
Sometimes that happens, and if you're and of course, not to mention the fact that some of our institutions, their digitization programs are a mess because data entry itni buri hui hai.
Oh my God.
And if your tags and your metadata there are lots of mistakes in it, it is useless.
Yeah.
Because none of your searches work.
And also, who is doing it? Like, do they have enough understanding of something?
Yeah. It is a mess. The National Archives particularly, oh God. It's just
I would hope that they are not.
Delhi Archives is better.
Okay.
But National Archives is
that's
really bad. So it's really bad.
Me and my friend, we were... So I've always been interested in libraries in general, right? Like, one of the best ways. And also, I'm like, हमारे पास public libraries क्यों नहीं है, right? Like like, and there was a more flourishing system of libraries, and then it went down, especially with the Delhi Public Library ecosystem. Yeah. So me and my friends me and another friend of mine, she's very interested. She studied sociology, now doing PhD. And so we just went to different libraries around Delhi, and we thought like लोग बहुत पूछेंगे कहाँ से आए हो, क्यों आए हो, वगैरह वगैरह. We just went there. People were very happy to talk, and they were very happy to rant. कि like ये नहीं हो रहा है हमारी library, ये नहीं हो रहा है, कुछ नहीं हो रहा है.
One of the historic libraries, Hardayal Public Library, the old Hardayal Library.
The Chandni. Chowk one.
Yeah, and we were like, I remember Intac was once asked for some conservation, this thing and all that, and we were consulting with them. And I realized that, they have such historic books. They have amazing books, but their staff was not paid their salaries for months.
Yeah, that's what they said.
They were, unko salary nahi diya hai. That is how it was going on.
8 महीने से नहीं दिया था. I mean.
And, the पैसा जो उन्होंने लिया, उससे उन्होंने एक conference room बना दिया. I mean, conference room बनाने का क्या फायदा? यार, improve the, and there were some of the librarians and all were really nice people. But, that you are not paying them. Improve their conditions, improve the readers' conditions, the look after the books. Conference center बना के क्या करो? Conference room बना के, it was like very disappointing. I was like very into iska, they wanted to do a digitization. I said, first of all, please don't reinvent the wheel. जो digitization हो चुका है, a lot of other institutions have done digitization. So if you have the same copy, you don't digitize it again.
Correct. No, 100%.
Do things which you have. So, they're very, I think many of our institutions have a very poor understanding of what should be the outcomes, what you should do, how to...
And it was really sad to see like such old library, like you said. Most of the stuff is just धूल में. पढ़ रहा है, like everything, because they don't have sufficient people to manage it or whatnot. I mean, I don't know. And they were just like, oh now, and the other libraries went, everyone, it was like, oh now अब तो UPSC वाले लोग ही आते हैं पढ़ने के लिए, और लोग नहीं आते हैं just for like पहले leisure के लिए आते थे लोग, newspaper पढ़ने आ रहे हैं. It was more of a space. Community libraries जो थी as part of library connection. I think it's so fascinating just looking at all of this, and I was just thinking about places that way as well. We are sitting in Jangpura. Yeah. And you were mentioning that Jangpura itself has such a fascinating history.
Jangpura is very interesting. First of all, it's in the kind of let's say in the field of the wider Nizamuddin area and Kilokri and all that. So it's a historic, the space itself is historic. But what is interesting is that this specific colony of Jangpura came up in the 1910s. And the background to it was that all the land that had been acquired for the making of New Delhi, think of it as the NDMC area. That is the New Delhi, the British built New Delhi.
Yeah.
So that was being built, all the land had been acquired, a lot of it was agricultural land, and those villagers, obviously, they went and bought land, they got some compensation, they went and bought land, in Haryana and further on, wherever they found land, they bought. There were other people who were not agriculturists. They are, maybe somebody has a shop or somebody does something else. They don't have a lot of land, but they have a house. Now that's been acquired, it's been demolished, and they wanted a place to stay. So they developed this Jangpura as a little colony, right? We're not talking about the extension of Jangpura, the main Jangpura. They built this, it's got a very neatly laid out grid plan, etc. They make that, and they name it after a British official, one Mr. Young.
Oh.
So it's Jangpura.
Jangpura.
It was established as Jangpura, but the people who lived there thought, "Ye Jangpura kya hai?" Jangpura. So it's been converted into Jangpura, but it was supposed to be Jangpura. I thought it was so interesting, this particular history of this place.
And who were these folks who were living here and then afterwards lived here as well?
So they were all people who had been displaced from the New Delhi, from these, there were these old villages. So many of the people who lived here had been old residents of Delhi, but from often the suburban or every part of Delhi has evolved over time, became New Delhi. So they were the original. And then of course, but in 1910s, that was the population there.
It's also very interesting how it's evolving, right? Like now you look at Jangpura, you're like, oh, a lot of, Punjabis or Sikhs live here, or lawyers live here a lot.
Right,
of course, because of proximity to Supreme Court and High Court as well. So how a place in itself is kind of evolving and
Absolutely. I mean, and some of the places that evolve the fastest are the so-called urban villages. So Delhi has a lot of places. Delhi just kind of, from the 1910s onwards, is just been expanding more and more and more. It's becoming more and more urban. And that process has been going on continuously. So a lot of what were agricultural lands were taken over and redeveloped into the colonies that we have in Delhi. And the village settlement, where the people had their houses, was still maintained and became our urban villages. All our Khidki, Humayunpur, whatever, many Begumpur, all of these villages, many of them have a historic core, which you can, often there are monuments there. Chirag Dilli is one of those villages. So many of these little villages are there, and many of them have a very interesting social life because they have become places where a lot of new migrants come and stay. So you'll identify people with different migrant communities also. And I remember I was working on a project which the DDA was working on a little while ago on making the new master plan for Delhi. So the new master plan for Delhi, they wanted to map heritage. And their idea, they came to Intact for that, and their idea was a very simple and somewhat boring one, jo bhi protected monuments hai, let us just map those. And there are a lot of protected monuments in Delhi, and they just wanted to map those monuments, right? And we said, why just restrict yourself to monuments? Map people, map these kind of things that, there are pockets which have, for instance, very interesting cuisine because of the dominant community that lives there, right? So there are very distinctive areas where you have different pockets of cuisine. Those are the kinds of things you should be mapping. they were not interested. So it never got done. But we really wanted to do that.
Yeah.
And, so these are the kind of heritage that we should also be mapping.
Yeah.
We should not restrict ourselves to things like buildings only.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I mean, intangible
Yeah.
heritage in a way. I mean, Lucknow, I think, recently became UNESCO Creative City of Gastronomy.
Yeah.
Hyderabad was the first
Yeah.
one as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And Delhi in itself, like you
Yeah.
said, you go to Sia Park, you get
Yeah.
a lot of Bengali food.
Yeah.
In Mayupur, you have so
Yeah.
many cuisines from Nagaland, you are
Yeah.
exploring Sikkim
Yeah,
and so many
yeah,
different
yeah.
cuisines, Arunachal.
Yeah.
You go to Majnu Katila
Yeah.
and you're finding more
Yeah, yeah.
different cuisines as well.
Yeah.
You go to Kamla Nagar
Yeah.
or Karol Bagh.
Yeah.
So in that way, like from a food point of view,
Yeah.
currently momos are one of the big craze
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Delhi.
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
like think about food, you think about chole bhature, you think about pani puri, you think about momos
Yeah.
currently, and like
Yeah.
a lot of other things.
Yeah.
How do you think the food, for example, with respect to Delhi, because so many people were coming in, even in the 19th century, like
Yeah.
you were saying, and currently as well, how has that kind of evolved over a period of time, and what kind of the choices were made even available to the people
Yeah.
who were living at the time?
So, food is one of those things that we think of ourselves as these very globalized people who are experimenting with new things and all that. But think of the kind of experimentation that has gone on among our ancestors. They adopted very, very new things. Things that we today consider an integral part of Indian cuisine. Things like potatoes and chilies
Yeah,
and
tomatoes.
tomatoes, and these are all new world foods that have come in, right? So the fact that they adopted so many of these tea is a very new thing.
Of course.
So in Mughal times, coffee drinking was a very elite thing. So the ordinary people would not have drunk these kind of things. It was only, there were these kehve khane, which were coffee shops in the chalks and all that, in the Chandni Chowk, etc. There were these coffee shops, the kehve khane, where people used to meet. Again, the elite and the poets would recite their poetry and things like that. So it was, all of that was happening. But tea drinking really took off in the 20th century, pushed by the British, who made the tea board and to promote tea drinking in India. So it keeps, and of course Delhi, of course, every new thing is people are willing to try. Also has a nice young population who are students, young people.
Yeah.
They're the ones who experiment first
Yeah.
with a lot of new things. So therefore it always helps.
Yeah, and currently having so many state bhavans
Yeah.
helps. Like,
Yeah.
some embassies have their own cafes.
Yeah.
I think the Korean Center has, the Korean food is the new craze as well.
Right.
Of course. So I think that's very interesting how it evolves. I think talking about people as well, and just touching on that, I mean, even going back to Jangpura. So there is Jangpura,
Yeah.
but there is Bhogal.
Yeah.
And Bhogal doesn't look as planned,
Yeah.
for example, on paper at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah.
It looks messier. It's more,
Yeah.
cramped quarters
Yeah.
per se versus like
Yeah,
some
yeah.
of these places in Jangpura. And so there are all these places in Delhi.
Yeah.
Right, you will find this.
Yeah.
So when we say, so people are like, oh, South Delhi is so posh. Like, no.
There are all
You
sorts of
can't
things.
like brush it as
Yeah.
something, right? You have,
Yeah.
spaces like Sangam Vihar,
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
these places where, migrant workers came
Yeah.
during Asian Games. So that segregation to exist in many ways, maybe because of income, maybe because of, your community you belong to, maybe religion,
Yeah.
other factors. So
Yeah.
in many ways, that segregation still exists in many parts. Why is that the case? Okay.
So one thing is there, I studied Old Delhi, Shahjahanabad, quite closely through a historic map that it's in the British Library, but I worked on a book that reproduced that map and gave it has a lot of detail. It's a huge map. So it gives every little gully, and many of the Havelis also are marked, etc. And I read books also of that period. And what I discovered was that the idea of segregation and carving out enclaves was not a Delhi thing at all. And people lived cheek by jowl irrespective of their religious persuasion to quite an extent. To some extent, what used to happen was that people coming from a particular area of the country would settle in some area. ये होता था, because when people come to a new place, they want to stay near the person who is from their village.
Or belong to a community.
Yeah. So sometimes that used to happen. So there was a Punjabi Katra, and there was the Kashmiris used to all stay in Bazar Sitaram. The Khatris were in Katranil, etc. So to some extent this happened, but otherwise people lived in a very totally mixed city. And again, these areas of exclusive large havelis, those kind of elite versus non-elite areas, was not that pronounced. But in fact, what I like about Delhi till fairly recently is that we have not had the kind of gated community living. It is begin. But in the last few years, it has happened that even the colonies have started putting gates.
Yeah.
But this kind of condo living, which is so popular in Gurgaon and all that, it's not been part of Delhi. And I like that. The fact that if you go to one of these condos, so I would much rather have a shopping area which is not a mall, because a mall is just such a sterile place. It's a sterile place and it excludes people. That not everybody is comfortable going into there because they feel that they're going to be judged. Right? It's a fact of life, and I don't like that. Why should publics? These are places where everybody should be comfortable going in. And I feel that these kind of colonies which lock themselves away, the condo complexes and all, these are all creating pockets in the city. I mean, I'm not saying that there have not been pockets where real estate is more expensive versus less expensive. That is a part of life. But when you start putting up physical barriers, that is the problem. I think.
No. I think which is a very common thing right now. You're like, which road is public?
Yeah.
And should it be really be?
Yeah. In theory, every road is public, right?
Yeah. And certain set of people in that area have decided, for XYZ reason, this is how it should be.
Yeah. And who they will allow in and who they won't allow in.
Which is like a very
exactly
controlling aspect, I think, and flow and everything, which again talks to you about, So, I mean, we live in a very patriarchal society, and our history itself is so patriarchal, at least a lot of it which is recorded, at least. And so we read about all these men, and so that's true for Delhi as well, but there are also a lot of women and queer folks who make up Delhi, who are doing so many things, even in power. I meant like that way, Of course, you talk about Razia Sultana and a lot of others, but when you look at Delhi, like who are the women of Delhi? I mean, that's a very broad thing. And who are the queer folks in Delhi? So,
one of course, women's voices again become difficult to recover. But, and so therefore, the ones that we have are often the elite women. You have elite women who are members of the royal family, members of the Mughal royal family, for instance. Many of them were patrons of architecture, they were patrons of the arts, etc. So we hear about them. There are a lot of places which are associated with, say, Jahanara, with her sister Roshanara, or for a later lady Qudsiya Begum who made Qudsiya Bagh, etc. So these are the kind of people that we keep hearing about. When it comes to women, there are also people who were the courtesans. So you hear about courtesans, and these were women. Some of them were powerful in their own right. Many of them were quite cultured, and there were people who were, and there were women who were poets also, and some of them were from regular folk in privileged families where they got an education, and some of them were courtesans too. And what happened, oddly enough, was that we tend to romanticize the courtesan a lot. And we must remember, again, critically looking at some of the sources from which we get our information, which is the 19th century. What was happening in the 19th century was that a lot of writers, particularly Urdu writers, were getting infected with the Victorian sensibility and were becoming a little defensive about the courtesan. And then, therefore, reinvented the courtesan as somebody who was emphasizing the cultural aspect, and almost there were people who said that the courtesans existed only in a cultural role, quite minimizing the fact that they were often sex work was a part of that, and this kind of nostalgia with the courtesan tends to minimize the marginalization of these women. We mustn't forget that these are marginal figures, and some of them may rise to positions where they have influence, etc. But that should not take away from the fact that often their beginnings were such that they didn't have agency, and they certainly did not have respectability. So all those things, that marginalization is there. The intersex people, etc., are a very interesting category. Eunuchs are a very important category in Mughal Delhi, and their agency was a good deal there in evidence, and they had definitely a very important place in society. Many of them, for instance, in the haram, which is the personal family quarters of the Mughal royal family, they had a very important role. In fact, the person who was in charge of the Mughal household was the Nazir, who was always a eunuch, but there were others also. So in these kind of positions, they often rose to quite a lot of power. So, but again, they and they were generally respected figures. So that is definitely, we can find that from, at least from my work in the 19th century, I can see all of that.
No, of course. I think which also talks about two things. One is this intentionality to find these lost stories, that lost history, or someone who has been focused enough on versus who existed, but we have never bothered enough to really look them and basically discover their story. And then kind of linking it to then the larger idea of conservation, and when we think about heritage, and which is both tangible and intangible as well. And you are very passionate about the heritage conservation, but I think your idea of heritage conservation is much more broad than how we usually understand it as well.
I mean, even if you look at simple thing like built heritage, right? Built heritage is what comes to our mind immediately when we start thinking of heritage, which is monuments and structures of some sort. There again, I think Delhi, at least from the point of view of legislation, there's a lot of work that has been done. There is legislation, etc. I think there's a big gap between legislation and implementation. I will not go into that. That is self-evident. But I think that the most important thing to consider there, and I would like people to think about this, we focus a lot on monuments without looking at what is the other kind of heritage. I mean, let me give you an example. In Old Delhi, in Shahjahanabad, there are more than 700 listed heritage buildings.
Just in Shahjahanabad. Wow.
They are protected by law under the Delhi Building Bylaws heritage clause, right? So in law protected. Implemented poorly, they keep getting demolished. I find it amazing that our authorities have not thought of this as something which needs to be protected, not simply as on paper as a law, but more actively, develop a vision for it. First of all, these are all owned by these are owned privately, right? Many of these buildings are owned privately or by some institution or the other, but mostly privately. We have not evolved a scheme by which we see this heritage as something which is an asset. We cannot have, and one thing that I think is very important to learn, that when we talk about heritage, we are always talking about we must have pride in our heritage. I think that's such a meaningless term. I'll tell you why it's meaningless. You will not preserve something simply out of a sense of sentimentality and a sort of abstract kind of pride even in your own ancestry or your own past or your own country's past or your city's past. You cannot survive on sentimentality until that historic structure in which you are living, maybe, or where you are hoping to start a business, until that gives you some returns, you cannot, you have no incentive in maintaining it. If the government today enacted the kinds of laws and policies that actually benefit people who own, so very simple, you can get a loan to build a new house. You can't get a loan to repair a 200-year-old house.
Oh.
It's a matter of policy. That's the fact. How is somebody going to do this, right? We need better policies. We need assistance. You need people to be able to go to a place to get technical support to conserve an old building, because it's built of materials that are not commonly in use today. And please remember that it can be an asset in terms of the whole area, all of Shahjahanabad. It's a historic precinct. And it can become a place where, I always keep saying this, that if I have to go sari shopping in Purani Delhi also, if there was a Haveli which was a sari shop, I would go there. No, it's just, it's so simple to think of this, but no, it will now not happen. People will demolish that Haveli, they'll build up one ugly showroom and retail out of that. If I were an entrepreneur, I would take one of those old, and they are beautiful Havelis. I would take one of those Havelis, I would make it into a B&B, not a luxury hotel. I would make it into a B&B. I would make it into a B&B where I would, you would have rooms, but a lot of it, maybe the angan jo hai, convert it into a little restaurant or something, and tie up with all the people there are many different food retailers outside, right? No kitchen in this thing, I mean a basic kitchen, but get all the food from these people, tie up with them to supply food, and you can have a place where you can, and I see that what happens in Purani Delhi is that often people don't have a place to sit to eat. There are a lot of places where seating is, a bit of a cramped, if it is there at all. I'll just tie up with these people to supply the khana and have a place where people can sit and enjoy the food, and there can be some rooms where people can stay also. So those kind of models, even if there is a chai shop, why should it not be in a historic building which is nicely and simply restored? I mean, it doesn't have to be, as I say that, the boutique hotel is a very poor model, because how many boutique hotels we will have? So this other thing that keeps happening is that the municipal corporation keeps hoping that somebody will convert this town hall into a 5-star hotel or luxury hotel. Nobody's going to make a luxury hotel in the middle of Shahjahanabad. No, it's not going to happen. Why not make it into a museum? The city doesn't have a museum. Can you imagine that? There's no Delhi City Museum. Where is the city story? Every city, most cities have a city museum, right? A city like Delhi, there is no museum which tells the story of Delhi. They're all kind of national this, national that. Where's the Delhi story being told? So when I was with Intact, we kept telling the municipal corporation, make it into a Delhi museum. Let's have the Delhi story being told somewhere also. And let's have, maybe some of the crafts, maybe eating places, whatever. We have a lack of imagination, and particularly heritage that is inclusive. I think we've done a very poor job on that. Because any time, and I've become reluctant to even push for conservation or for raising the level of upkeep of some of these places, because I fear that they will be turned into exclusive pockets.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, let me give you the example of, say, Mehrauli Archaeological Park. Mehrauli Archaeological Park is an amazing, fascinating park. And in fact, in TAC, when I was I think I was co-convener when we filed this case in the Delhi High Court, asking for, better upkeep, etc., etc. And what I see has happened is that people are very happy about it, and I am not, because they say one part of it has been conserved and nicely, a huge amount of effort has been put into one area. They have made a cafe and this and that
lake,
and the other. But why have you taken that pocket out, conserved it, or whatever you have done to it, made it into an exclusive ticketed place, and the rest of it can go to hell? I don't agree with that. My parents are very annoyed with this Sundar nursery. They said this was the nursery where we used to come to buy our plants. It was an open place. You could walk in there, whatever. Okay, they have done it up and all that. Again, you've made a place of privilege. So you are saying that you will concentrate your attention to these little pockets which will be pleasant for people who can afford to come there on a regular basis. And you will keep, and you will take places out of public use and carve out these, make them into these places. And that is my problem. I remember the first time this happened was many years ago, I think in the 90s, when there's a big Maidan in front of Red Fort. It's fenced and it's green lawn, right? It used to be open. People used to play there. Yeah. There used to be games happening there. There used to be people in the middle of the day sleeping in the sun, whatever, just hang out. It was a place, and it was very important because the city, Shahjahanabad, doesn't have a lot of open space, right? So it was a place, an open space. And of course it was dusty and the grass was dying, and that happens because people use it, right? But this minister came who said, "Nahi, this is looking very ugly, it has to be maintained." One sarkari word that I hate is beautification. I dislike this word of beautification. They wanted to beautify it. So that means they have to plant grass, which will consume huge amounts of water. They will plant grass, and because the grass will die if people come there, so you fence it off so that nobody can go there. So now you have a great green lawn, which only I think becomes operational when they have these, Diwali ke around, Dashera Diwali ke around, melas, etc. And that's it. No, so public spaces are shrinking in a city which has more and more people coming in, and less public spaces. So for me, heritage means heritage for people, for the people who live here. And if I have a beautiful monument which is not inclusive, I think I'm against the policy that if you pay in cash, you pay a higher rate for monument tickets than if you use electronic means. I think that's very discriminatory, and it discriminates against people who don't have electronic access. And access to electronic means of payment is a privilege in this country, right? So you are excluding you're discriminating on the very people who can least afford that. I find these things very disturbing, I think. Yeah. So I think our policies around heritage have not been inclusive at all. And therefore, I still do these walks for awareness, etc., but I retreat into history. And I'm not sure I want to participate in the heritage space all that much.
I mean, I think just talking about grass, for example, you were giving an example of that. and you were saying built history, but there's also ecological.
Yeah.
Sorry, built heritage, but there's also ecological heritage, right? That exists.
Yeah.
A lot of these indigenous trees or like shrubs, like just that just existed, and then over a period of time, it kind of became. Of course, like there will always be plants or something which came from outside, like which will kind of overpower, like which happened in the hills, for example, as well, with pines and all.
Yeah.
But I think, what about the idea of conserving the ecological history?
We've done a very poor job of that also. One very serious thing is that the water in the city. That we have, the way we have built is the natural drainage we have completely destroyed. There was a logic to the natural drainage of the city, which is between the hills and the Aravali, the ridge and the river. And we have obstructed all of them, and that's one of the reasons why we keep having this flooding. After they built that road on the Bela, also on the floodplain of the Yamuna, you started having that flooding in civil lines and all that. That severe flooding has started after that, right? So flooding happens, trees. And there are ways and ways in which you can redevelop. So these government colonies in Nauroji Nagar was redeveloped. They cut down so many trees. Old big trees were cut down. Why could you not devise a plan where the existing houses maybe could have been made a little higher? You could break down those houses, redevelop it, make slightly try and conserve some of those trees. You don't have to cut down so many trees. So that again, it's one of my important reasons why I say that you should conserve the New Delhi area. People are saying, it's a waste of space. There is all these low rises, big bungalows and all. At least usi bahane we have some trees. It forms like a lung in the city, right, in the middle of the city. So I think it's a very urgent thing. And my pet peeve, they have built a city over the years which is very pedestrian unfriendly. Very, very pedestrian unfriendly. I like to use at least the metro. I haven't used buses in a while, but I use the metro regularly. And one important, that I can understand why people, if they have a choice, they don't want to use the metro, because when you use public transport, as soon as you get out, you don't need to walk. And we have not made safe pedestrian crossings. You keep making flyovers so that cars can go faster. You're making, again, the kind of vision that you have for the city. I really want to ask the town planners, what is the kind of city you want to build? Are you building a city for cars? Or are you seriously about building a city with fewer cars? And then you keep complaining about pollution and this and that. So, as you say, this is a very, jaundiced view of what's going on.
But I think walkability is a big part.
Yeah.
Right? Like now we look at, for example, how Chandni Chowk has been redeveloped and reimagined. And they removed all the cars from that central lane, right from Red Fort to all the way to the mosque that goes. Lesser cars still, all the three rickshaws and everything.
So I have mixed views about that as well. And I'll tell you why. You have made that one stretch, but that doesn't solve, it's not as if now overnight every person who is coming to Chandni Chowk is start using public transport. No. What will happen is, and does happen is, people come by their Uber or car or taxi or whatever and get dropped off in front of their Jain Mandir.
Yeah.
So it has not had an impact as such. The problem with that stretch was not that it was narrow, but it was poorly managed. It is still poorly managed. Now there's different kinds of encroachment there. And then of course, the design of it with all that red sandstone and all, I think we need to look at more sustainable alternatives. I'm against, by the way, using red sandstone or beige sandstone for anything except agar a part of the wall of the Red Fort falls down, please repair it with red sandstone. But otherwise, don't make your pavements with red sandstone. The ASI makes toilets in the monuments and covers it with red sandstone. Why so much red sandstone? Why are we quarrying hills? We are using much more sandstone than the Mughals ever used. we really need to rethink our, sustainability is not something that we think of at all. And it should be a part of conservation. It should be a part of development. I think these conversations need to be had.
And so when you look globally, in India, by the way, any other place or city or even globally as well, are there some like great examples of how conservation has been thought? Because what you're saying is not just conserving one aspect. You're talking from a very systems lens. You're saying how everything works together. It's about ecology. It's about urban policy. It's about, people. It's about the build things. And so are there examples in India or abroad where you feel like, such a great example?
Better than Delhi, so of course you'll see so many examples because just we are so bad. But even small places like, say, when I'm talking about how private individuals can benefit from heritage. If you look at a place like Pondicherry, if you look at Kochi, there are businesses which are built on the heritage of that local place. There are just, so I give this example sometimes when I'm called for these tourism conclaves. As I said, you are missing out on huge opportunities because you don't look at heritage as something that a community participates in.
Right.
Because I give this example of there's a small town in the southern US called Savannah. Right? And Savannah has about 1/10 the population of Agra. It has 4 times the number of tourists that Agra gets. Can you imagine that? 4 times the number of tourists. Why? Because it has a town center which it has nicely maintained, and the old town has been nicely maintained. The houses have been restored and revived, and one of them is a little hotel, one of them is a restaurant, one of them is a shop, one of them is a small museum. People want to come and spend time over there. People don't come to your city to tick off 1 or 2 sites. They want to experience your city. Until you build a city that is nice and pleasant for your own citizens, you will not get tourists either. So, it's just, there are many, many examples. I haven't looked at it from that point of view, but that's one example I keep giving.
Yeah. And we're coming towards the closing of our podcast episode as well. But a couple of things. One being that if you were a member of parliament which was elected in the national elections and you were sitting there right now, what is that one bill or something similar that you would introduce? Or it can be a reimagining of something that already exists.
Yeah, I would consider, how some of these things, particularly bodies that already exist, like the Archaeological Survey of India, how it can learn to work with people. Learn to work with people, give people who live around heritage structures a stake in that. You have the Taj Mahal, which is completely divorced from Tajganj, the settlement which is next to it. There could be this great synergy between the two, where all the traffic that comes to Taj Mahal would, you could take them to Tajganj, they could experience the city and living in a historic settlement, and they would, instead of doing a day trip to Agra, would stay there for 4 days. Those kind of things. But we live in pockets, and particularly our government bodies tend to be totally isolated from either experts or people. And both of them. They are suspicious of experts because they fear criticism, and they are divorced from communities, the community, because they think that's too messy to have to deal with, the different kinds of things that people will ask for, and So I think there's been a lot of talk of decolonization. I think we need to decolonize there, because these are institutions that were built in the colonial times.
Yeah,
and continue to function in those ways.
Right. And I think you're just talking about people, right? And you talk a lot about the participatory idea of heritage conservation, history, and like a lot of other things as well. And how bringing everyone together is one of the ways, because I think it also speaks to the idea what you were saying earlier. No one will just protect or upkeep something just because of pride.
Yeah, Yeah.
There's a larger sense of, why should I continue doing it over a period of time that helps as well.
Yeah, and therefore I'm glad that in a small sense, there are people who are being able to make careers out of heritage. Even though, history, whether it's the historic walks or cultural experiences, that is happening now.
Yeah.
There are people who are making a career out of this. I think that's a good sign, because that's the way forward, I feel. That people will begin to feel a stake in heritage, to see that this is important for me, because I can, these, until your livelihoods are tied up with it, it becomes pretty meaningless.
Yeah. No, and Delhi's intangible heritage is so vast. From qawwalis to ghazals to dastan-e-goi and so much, which itself can also be like, the, just limited to very privileged spaces, like these very ticketed and like, was that always the case in the previous era as well?
So, dastan-goi used to be something that was a street art. People used to sit on the steps of the Jama Masjid. These performers used to gather there and tell stories. So it was a very, very public thing. It was a very public thing. And people would gather around, and they would kind of leave a little bit of money to the Dastan go.
Right.
So, it was not an elite thing at all in that day. And the last Dastan Go, we actually have recordings from them from the early 20th century also.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to see them, where would they go? Would they be on YouTube or something?
No. These are not video recordings. These are audio recordings.
Audio recordings.
Yeah. So I remember listening to it at some point. I think the Linguistic Survey of India or somebody had made recordings of the last Dastan Goes.
That's very interesting. And I think even like, I think one way is like, if you want to listen to a qawwali, you can go to Hazrat Nizamuddin on a Thursday night at 9, and you can listen to that. Similarly, you want to listen to certain chants. So there are like different spaces as well where you can still go and experience all of that.
Certainly.
But there are like other intangible spaces.
There are there are performance traditions, there are art traditions. One way which I feel that a lot of artists in Delhi who cannot afford big galleries, I had suggested once, I remember we had, as again with Intact, had suggested that some of these monuments could become a place for exhibitions of artwork, right? Which would not be, we leap from this thing that a monument should be this sanitized space to let's open it for events like shadis. You don't have to make that leap from this to that. Make the leap, take a small step. Something which will not damage the monument, which will not take away from the sanctity of a tomb or a mosque or something. Have an art exhibition. Some artists just, and preferably people who are living around there, so that they feel that this is their space. But, that kind of thing.
No, of course. And I think just talking about people, what is the simplest way a Delhiite, someone who's living in Delhi or neighboring regions, can start engaging with, some of this heritage around Delhi?
Go walking. You don't have to join a walking tour. These days, these things are becoming easy because they are all mapped on Google Maps. I had written my book, 14 Historic Walks of Delhi, a long time ago when all of this was not there. These apps were not there. But there are apps and there are Google Maps and blogs from people, etc. Just start discovering. Whether it's a historic site or a news site, walking is still the best way. Do that.
I remember, this is like 13 years back, I had this phone, very basic internet, and I used to download Lonely Planet site recommendations. And so, I'm going to different places in Jaipur or otherwise, and I'm just doing all of that. And, I think through that, these are the food places to go. But then I think the virtue of just walking on your own and discovering more things,
absolutely.
just talking to people so much as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Just like helps you,
Yeah.
I think, discover or feel an aspect of Delhi that
Absolutely.
exists as well. I think as we come towards the end of the episode, I think one last bit I want to touch on the documentation itself. Like, how does, like you were just talking about, a lot of people are living in the age of digital tools, GPS storytelling. How do we still actively document things like today, which will become like heritage for the future? Like today we don't think. Like I was wondering, like this cup that I have right now, we look back at something which is like 500 years back, and we're like, oh my god.
So very simply, I would say 2 or 3 things. One is the whole monument business, right? I regret the fact that some of the places I didn't photograph 28 years ago when I started doing walks, for instance, or discovering the city. We didn't have too many cameras, and one didn't bother because one always thought that the monuments were unchanging. And they're not unchanging. They change. Photographs. You suddenly see that some panel has fallen off. I after COVID, I went and I saw that Lodi Garden, where there's a mosque, and one of the inscriptions of plaster had just disappeared. So that was like, a shock to me. So those kind of things happen. So that one is. The other thing is that we now live in a time of huge possibilities in terms of the documentation of personal histories and family histories. A lot of people throw away family papers, particularly when you are changing house, you are downsizing, or every generation is clearing out Purana Kagas and throwing it away. Our public institutions don't have a system of private archives. Only private archives of so and so, maybe public figures or freedom fighter type people and that kind of thing. But they don't have a system but for us, we can do it now. You can create digital archives of at least your own family papers. I think this is something, should be a movement where every person who has a smartphone should be doing this on a family by family basis to create archives for their own families, to document your own family's history and to preserve it, and to pass it on for historians who might find that interesting today or tomorrow, later, wherever.
Which is so interesting. My dad, he used to tell me, so like in this small town, and he was running like a small business, medicine business, and he said, oh, there is this person whose family has been coming for 10 generations to a place, and they like roam around and all, but they have a history of our family for 10-15 generations, like in this one notebook they have been writing in some ways, and so they knew a lot. Because I was one time very interested, we know up until this moment what before that, right? It's like, they have been coming, and then they take us money, and then they kind of update at times, and then they go away as well. I was like, and then he said, he hasn't been coming for like 10 years. I was like, why did you never like write somewhere or just like take a picture somewhere? I don't know, did something so that, we also have it with us.
So I think it's important. I think, and now we can do it very easily, right?
Yeah.
You can just take a picture and
keep it. Now the challenge is how to manage and maintain all of that.
So you have to, I was again thinking that maybe an app would be something, a tool which would enable people to catalog and keep and preserve and save.
A very cool business idea if someone wants to play.
Please do it.
and I think so. One of the last questions I have for you is, I think if for our listeners or viewers, if we can recommend 3 books to read, 2 things to watch or listen, or 1 person to follow. This is something we ask everyone. Is there anything? You can take your time, but any, and you don't have to fix. You don't have to do 3 only.
Yeah, no. It's this is such a challenge because then you're trying to pin me down to things which So one book that I find very interesting to read is by something called The Great Hedge of India by Roy Moxham. And the reason I like it is because it demonstrates how historical research should be done. The fact that new things can be discovered. This guy discovered this great salt hedge. There was a salt policy of the British government, and they planted this huge hedge across the country. And how this man discovers this in the archive and then goes and discovers it on the ground. It's a lovely story of how historical research can happen. So, this is one of my favorite books that I always keep recommending to people. One book of mine which I would recommend, which is The Broken Script. This is about late Mughal Delhi. Please read it, because to me, this is the most important work that I have done. I've done all sorts of things, but this is the most important work I've done, and I think you will enjoy it. Definitely read that. It becomes, also what happens is that a lot of the books that I read are also books of Urdu poetry and all, and therefore I find it quite difficult to recommend some of those. Like one book that I find very illuminating is something called Fughane Delhi, and that was a book of the poetry of 1857. Various poets after 1857 wrote about that. But again, it's available only in Urdu. Maybe at some point I will think of translating it.
So AI can also help these days with the translation.
But it's very complicated because these are, poetry needs
100%.
literary work.
You're so right, of course.
Yeah, so I'll sit and translate it one day.
Oh.
I'll write it, but so that kind of thing is there. As far as watching
or listening,
I don't know, or listening. I don't know. I'm very. I'm just absolutely hopeless in that regard. I don't watch anything. I don't listen. I listen to like various weird podcasts.
Oh, really? Please do tell more.
Things like atheist podcasts and stuff like that. I'm like totally out of it, shall we say?
Of course.
But I like to. I would say to people who are listen to things like history podcasts and all, but keep an open mind.
Of course.
Do question. Also look at credentials always. I do say that, because when you're looking at history particularly, ask yourself, is this person an actual historian? So, that is something that...
Yeah. And so from that lens, is there one person that you recommend to just follow in general? Please follow Dr. Swapna.
No, I have not been, so I don't listen to,
it can be any person in general. It doesn't have to be for listening.
No. Okay. I don't believe in creating Bhakt Mandalis for anybody. Not even for myself. You may like something that I've said today, and tomorrow you may not like something that I've said. That's fine. I change, and you will not agree with everything I say. So I don't recommend that anybody follows anybody as a whole.
Of course. No, definitely. And also that questioning is so
Yeah. So enjoy there's so much being written and spoken about in history. Just go out and consume whatever there is with a critical eye.
No, 100%. And finally, I think this is again something we ask everyone is would you suggest any names to us? Someone we can invite on this podcast.
Yeah, I would have said about somebody like Professor Narayani Gupta, who would be, I don't know whether she would do it or not, but she is somebody I admire very deeply, because she was my inspiration for starting researching 19th century Delhi. She was the person who first introduced me to Intac, and she has such an insightful view of Delhi, its heritage, its history, but its living heritage. And that is something, I think very few people combine all those things, who have a deep understanding of the past as well as a very sensitive reading of the city as it is. So that would be the ideal person to talk to. And she's such an interesting person to talk to as well. She's wonderful with kids, for instance. I mean,
which is so.
Yeah.
I mean, like
exactly.
Which is a very unique skill. Not everyone is, but also as a historian, like kids would love that as well. Finally, you wrote a postcard to your future self. Would love for you to share it with our listeners and viewers.
Right. So let's say that. I said, dear future Swapna, you have always explored new paths, and I hope you never stop doing that. Never stop learning, and always talk to young people. Swapna.
Oh, that's beautiful. I think that emphasis on young people as well.
Yes, I find I interact with a lot of young people because I do give talks at universities, etc. A lot of the people who come for my walks are younger people, and I find it most interesting to talk to young people because they have a lot of questions, and I hope that I am sort of inspiring them to think of the city and think of heritage and think of history in new ways. So they are young people. You guys are the future. So therefore, for me, that's very important.
No, of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Swapna, for making time on a Saturday to come on a podcast and sharing all your beautiful reflections, insights, and stories so heartwarmingly. While listening to you, I'm taking so much away, like so much inspiration about like small things that we can do to protect our heritage, but also in general. I think through this conversation only, I have particularly discovered, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers would have, just like new parts of Delhi, aspects of Delhi, and like made me really think about, this is also Delhi, how we don't really think about. So thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
I'm reminded of this quote by Mirza Ghalib. एक रोज अपनी रूह से पूछा कि दिल्ली क्या है. एक रोज अपनी रूह से पूछा कि दिल्ली क्या है, तो यूं जवाब में कह गए, ये दुनिया मानो जिस्म है और दिल्ली उसकी जान. And that's why sometimes Delhi is also referred to as Dil Walon Ki Delhi. Before I close this episode, please do like, share and subscribe. Your love and comments mean a lot to us. Wherever you are watching or listening at YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, don't forget to see our Postcards Notion page for this episode. The link is in the description. It will allow you to deeply discover a lot of aspects of Delhi. There are fiction that we recommend. There is non-fiction that we recommend there. There are also visual novels, other stories, the research, articles to read, the transcript of the episode, and a lot more out there for you to discover. Delhi is such a beautiful city. On my mug, there are these few lines that I'll share. ये दिल्ली है जनाब, यहाँ कोई काम वक्त पर नहीं होता और कोई काम ऐसा भी नहीं जो वक्त रहते नहीं होता. Credit to पुराने दिल्ली वाले. And I also want to give a huge shout out and credit to the team that worked tirelessly behind the scenes for making this episode possible. First of all, a huge thank you to Natasha for brilliantly researching for this episode in the background. A huge thank you to our content and media team with Naisha and Diksha, who supported the production as well as the media of this episode. And also thank you to another team member, Kavish, who led the community efforts. This is Nikunj, your host for today, signing off, and we'll be back soon with another episode very shortly. Take care. Bye.